My name is Private Louise Rogers, 19 years old, U.S. Army. On leave in Charleston, my stepfather pressed a revolver to my chest. The shot seared through me. I grabbed his phone, his secrets, and ran bleeding into the night. A deaf stranger signed to me. His ID read, Lieutenant General. What would you do if you saw this unfold? Drop your thoughts and hit subscribe. My name is Private Louise Rogers, 19 years old, United States Army. That uniform they issued me at Fort Jackson. Olive drab, scratchy at the seams, buttons that never quite wanted to shine enough, was still the proudest thing I owned. It was my proof that I'd made it through the furnace. My escape ticket from a house that had swallowed me whole for over a decade. But the night I stepped back inside that house on leave, I felt the old gravity pulling me down again, as if every scar on the wallpaper had been waiting. Charleston in July is a heavy, wet kind of heat, the kind that sticks to your skin even at midnight. The cicadas outside sang their endless drone, a sound I had grown up with, but which now made me feel caged, not comforted. The kitchen smelled of stale bourbon and fried grease that never quite washed out of the walls. My stepfather, Thomas Walker, sat hunched at the table with a half-empty glass. The bottle was sweating in his grip. My mother hovered nearby, small and silent, her hands worrying at a dish towel, though the dishes were already put away. I had changed. He hadn't. Thomas had built his kingdom on silence and cheap intimidation. He came into our lives when I was 8, carrying nothing but a grin that never reached his eyes and a phone that never left his hip. He learned fast that my mother would fold if pressed and that I could be bent by humiliation. He never needed to raise his hand often. He used smaller cruelties, little humiliations that stuck deeper than blows. I remember one. I was 9, carrying a glass of milk to the table, wearing my favorite yellow shirt with a cartoon sunflower. I tripped on the rug. The glass shattered, milk spreading like a white pool at my feet. He didn't yell, didn't strike me. Instead, he made me strip off that shirt, drop to my knees, and mop the floor with it until the fabric was shredded and gray. He watched, silent, arms folded, until something bright inside me dulled. Another time, when I was 11, I was locked in my room on the morning of a choir audition. I had practiced for weeks, singing in the shower, humming until my throat hurt. He claimed later he misplaced the key. I sat against the door, pounding until my knuckles bled, hearing the sound of his truck rumble away with my mother in the passenger seat. By the time they returned, the audition was over. He dangled the key before me with a smirk. Found it. My voice never came back the same after that. Not in front of him. By 16, I had hidden an Army recruitment poster under my mattress, the only dream I allowed myself. He found it, tore it to ribbons while calling me a traitor. Shoved me into a wall so hard that plaster cracked right at eye level. That jagged black line stared at me every night after, like a fracture in the house itself. To me, it was prophecy. One day the house would break, and when it did, I would walk out. Now, standing in the same kitchen years later, my uniform starched and my boots planted, I could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. I wasn't the small girl he could humiliate anymore. I stood straighter, shoulders back, spine reinforced by drill sergeants who had burned obedience into me and built something stronger out of the ashes. He didn't like it. He swirled the bourbon in his glass, watching me the way you watch a dog that might bite. You think that cheap soldier suit makes you better than me? His words slurred, but his intent was razor sharp. Your paycheck is my paycheck. My mother's voice was a whisper, almost lost under the refrigerator's hum. Louise, just give it to him. Don't make him mad. I met his stare, calm, measured, like I had been taught at the range. Fix on your target, breathe steady. That money is mine. It's for my service. For my future. That last word seemed to strike him like a match to dry tinder. His face twisted, eyes narrowing. He set the glass down hard enough that bourbon splashed over the rim. The cicadas outside kept droning, but inside the kitchen everything felt taut, stretched to the breaking point. And then I noticed it. Small, ordinary but more dangerous than the gun I suspected he kept close. His phone, lying on the table, screen still faintly lit. For years it had been the object he protected more than anything. He guarded it with paranoia, hid it from sight, shielded it with passwords. A little black rectangle, no bigger than my palm, but it contained every secret, every scheme, every rotten thread of his life. I didn't know it yet, but that phone would be the crack in his armor. The prophecy written into plaster years ago was still waiting. Tonight, it was about to split wide open. The air in that kitchen had turned thick, like even oxygen was waiting for Thomas's next move. His jaw worked, grinding invisible stones, and his hand slid to the drawer by his chair. I knew that drawer. Every creak of it had meant danger since I was a child. Tonight, when it opened, the metallic scrape of a revolver sliding free echoed louder than it should have. He pointed the gun at my chest as if it was just another night, another lesson in control. His breath smelled of bourbon and resentment. "You think you can defy me in my own house?" My mother whimpered, backing into the corner, her hands pressed over her mouth. The cicadas outside droned on, oblivious. I stood straighter, blood pounding in my temples. Every drill sergeant's voice reminding me that panic is the fastest way to lose. "I'm not giving you my pay," I said quietly. "Not tonight. Not ever." His face twisted. The gun barked. A deafening crack split the air, swallowing every other sound. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Cicadas silenced. Refrigerator hum vanished. Even my own pulse seemed to stop. Then it all came crashing back. A ringing roar in my ears, the acrid stink of gunpowder, my mother's scream. The pain was fire, white-hot and electric, ripping through the flesh just below my collarbone. My knees buckled and I crashed backward onto the linoleum. The floor was cold and sticky from the bourbon he'd spilled earlier, seeping into my shirt. My head struck tile, sending a shudder of teeth-rattling vibration through my skull. I blinked through the haze. Thomas wasn't panicked. He wasn't even surprised. He lowered the revolver, his lips curling into a smirk, satisfied like a man who'd finally swatted an annoying fly. My mother's voice cracked, but it wasn't for me. "Thomas, the wall, look what you've done to the wall." She pointed at the bullet hole punched through fresh paint, horrified at plaster dust, not the blood soaking her daughter's shirt. That betrayal hurt more than the bullet. It hollowed me out, left me colder than the floor beneath my cheek. Thomas sighed, annoyed, like his evening had been inconvenienced. He muttered just loud enough for me to hear over the ringing in my ears. "See? You always make things difficult." That was the moment something hardened inside me. The pain sharpened, focused, became fuel instead of weight. My drill sergeant's words echoed. Weakness leaves the body. I thought, I will not die here. Not in this kitchen, not in this house. I pushed against the slick floor, forcing my eyes level with the overturned table. Shards of glass glittered like ice under the dim bulb, and there, lying among them, was his phone. Its screen still glowed faintly, a rectangular tumor of secrets. Everything I had endured, every humiliating trick, every silent dinner, clicked into place. That phone was his command center, his weakness, his den. My mother was still frozen in her corner, sobbing over plaster. Thomas turned toward her, barking, "Shut up, Linda, it's just a scratch." That was my opening. I coiled, ignoring the fire lancing down my arm. I lunged. My hand slid across linoleum slick with bourbon and glass. Shards cut my palm, but I barely felt them. My fingers closed around cold metal. His phone, solid, real. I shoved it into my cargo pocket, clenching it tight as if it were a rifle on the range. Evidence, weapon, lifeline. Adrenaline drowned the pain. My body moved on training. Get to cover, get to safety, preserve the objective. I scrambled to my feet, staggering toward the back door. The screen slammed open, then shut behind me with a sharp report. Thomas's roar followed. Enraged, Get back here, you little... A crash cut him off. Maybe the table, maybe a chair, maybe his own stumble. I didn't look back. The humid Charleston night wrapped me in its heavy blanket, but I kept moving, each step a jolt of agony and defiance. I wasn't just running from him. I was running with something that could end him. And for the first time, the battlefield wasn't his. It was mine. The night air hit me like a wall of wet wool, thick with marsh salt and the sour tang of asphalt baking under the July sun. Each breath clawed at my lungs, dragging fire from my wounded shoulder down into my ribs. I didn't know where my legs were carrying me. I only knew I couldn't stop. The streets blurred past. Dim porches, peeling shutters, the flicker of a neon sign half burned out. I followed some instinct deeper into the city until the pavement tilted toward the water. That's how I ended up at the riverfront park, the place my grandmother once brought me as a child to watch sailboats drift past the docks. Tonight, the benches stood empty under the glow of tired street lamps, shadows stretching long under the branches of live oaks draped in Spanish moss. I collapsed onto one of the wrought iron benches. My whole body shook with aftershocks. The wound in my shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, soaking my undershirt until the fabric clung cold against my skin. I pressed my good hand hard against it, but the pressure barely slowed the flow. For the first time since that trigger had pulled, the adrenaline began to ebb. What replaced it was worse. Dizziness, bone-deep exhaustion, and a loneliness that threatened to crush me harder than the pain. I pulled in the humid night air, trying to remember the calm breathing drills we learned on the range. In for 4. Hold. Out for 4. But the breaths came jagged, uneven. Then I saw him. At the far end of the path, near the railing that overlooked the dark river, an older man stood. His back was straight, not casual like a tourist, but squared the way only years of habit can shape a body. He wore a neatly pressed shirt tucked into khaki slacks, clothes too deliberate for a late-night wander. White hair caught the street lamp glow, making a kind of halo around him. I tried to stay still, but when I shifted on the bench, a ragged gasp escaped me. The man turned. For a second, his gaze swept right past, then locked on me. My uniform was torn, my shirt soaked, blood dark against the fabric. He began walking toward me, slow and measured, hands visible at his sides. My instincts screamed danger. I pushed myself back against the bench, my free hand snapping to the cargo pocket where I'd shoved Thomas's phone. He stopped about 10 feet away. Then, slowly, he raised his hands, palms open in a universal gesture of peace. His mouth moved, but the words didn't reach me. He touched his ear, shook his head. Deaf. The bitter irony hit like a punch. The one stranger who noticed me was someone I couldn't even speak to. But then a buried memory surfaced. My cousin Sarah, born deaf, and the afternoons my aunt had spent teaching me a handful of signs so we could play together. My hands shook as I tried to remember them. I tapped my chest. Hurt. I moved my fingers awkwardly like wings. Need. Then I stretched my hand out, palm up. Help, hurt, need, help. His eyes softened. He nodded once, decisive. Then his hands moved with a fluid grace I could never match. He signed. I understand. Stay, don't be afraid. Tears stung the corners of my eyes. For the first time since the gun went off, someone was looking at me. Not as a burden, not as a wall repair waiting to happen, but as a human being who needed help. The phone slipped from my lap and clattered onto the pavement. I lunged for it, panic rising, but he stooped faster. For one terrifying moment, I thought he'd open it, expose the secret I had risked my life to take. Instead, he looked at it, then placed it gently back into my hand, closing my trembling fingers around it. That gesture, silent, respectful, was the first lifeline I'd been handed in years. He pulled out his own phone, typed quickly, and held the screen toward me. 4 simple words glowed against the light. Taxi to Roper Hospital? I nodded, unable to say more. He slipped the phone away, lifted his hand in a calm, stay here motion, and moved to the curb. When headlights finally cut through the moss-shrouded shadows, he opened the taxi door, then came back for me. His grip on my good arm was firm, steady, professional. His hand was rough with calluses, yet impossibly gentle. That was how I left the park. Not alone, not broken, but held upright by the hands of a stranger who spoke without sound and understood more than anyone had in years. The taxi ride felt unreal, a blur of sodium streetlights and the low hum of tires over uneven asphalt. Every bump jolted my shoulder, but the stranger beside me sat calm, steady. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But his presence filled the small cab with a strange, quiet authority. His hand remained near mine on the seat, close enough that if I lost consciousness, I knew he would anchor me back. The driver glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, no doubt clocking the blood soaking my shirt, but said nothing. Once the older man leaned forward, showed his phone screen with the hospital's address, and handed over a folded bill. There was no panic in the way he moved, no wasted gesture. It reminded me of drill sergeants in the field, decisive, efficient, unshakable. We reached Roper Hospital, its glass doors glowing like a fortress in the night. The man helped me out, steadying my good arm and walked me through the sliding doors. The smell of antiseptic hit immediately, cold and clean, so different from the bourbon-stained air I'd escaped. The triage nurse looked up, eyes widening at the sight of me. "Gunshot wound?" she asked sharply. I managed a nod, my throat raw. She waved for orderlies. A gurney appeared, hands guided me down, the fluorescent lights overhead passing in blinding strips. I clutched my cargo pocket, feeling the hard rectangle of Thomas's phone pressing into my thigh. My lifeline. A young resident bent over me, snapping on gloves. "Through and through," he muttered after a quick exam. "Lucky, no artery hit." He pressed gauze against my shoulder, and pain flared white, nearly knocking me under. "Police need to be called," the nurse said. "It's protocol." The words sent a ripple of panic through me. If Thomas had already spun his story, if the first officers I met carried his version, I'd be cornered before I could even speak. That was when the older man stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He had no voice to raise. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small, worn leather notebook. His handwriting was neat, precise, almost architectural as he wrote 3 words and held the page up for the nurse. "I'll handle notifications." The nurse hesitated, then nodded. There was something about him, something that made even professionals pause and defer. I turned my head and saw him remove his wallet. From inside a clear sleeve, he slid out an identification card and placed it on the blanket beside me. The light from the ceiling panels caught the seal first, Department of the Army. Below that, in stark capital letters, Callahan, Robert J., and under his name, Lieutenant General. 3 silver stars gleamed back at me. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. The quiet stranger who had signed help in the park wasn't just a veteran. He wasn't retired brass reminiscing by the water. He was an active-duty 3-star general. My breath caught. I looked at him, wide-eyed, and he gave the faintest, almost apologetic smile, then tapped the card. He signed 2 words I could read even with my fumbling memory. "On leave." Then he swept his hand horizontally as if erasing something. His leave, in that moment, was over. What followed didn't resemble panic or improvisation. It was controlled firepower, delivered quietly. He used his phone, text-to-speech apps, typed messages, to make calls that mattered. I heard the synthesized voice on the speaker say calmly, "This is Lieutenant General Robert J. Callahan. I need Fort Jackson staff duty on the line." Pause. Then, "I have a private under my protection who sustained an off-post gunshot wound in Charleston. Notify the chain. Initiate victim advocate support. Civilian jurisdiction leads the case. I will coordinate Army liaison." He sent another message to a provost marshal contact. to be aware of Charleston PD involvement and to ensure military police liaison readiness, not interference. He requested a special victims counsel to be alerted for me. Every word was clipped, professional, never wasted. Watching him, I realized the machine I had joined, the Army, was suddenly alive around me, turning its gears because one man had pulled the right levers. And he was doing it without raising his voice, without even speaking at all. The nurse returned, paperwork in hand. "We'll have to restrict visitors if you're in danger," she said. He wrote in his notebook, then showed it to her. "Restrict Thomas Walker. Document by name. Call security if he appears." She blinked, then nodded again, sliding the order into my file. On my wrist, the hospital band clicked into place, marked with time and date. Evidence already forming a chain. Gauze bound tight to my wound, IV started, vitals noted. Every step written down. Through the fog of pain, a strange clarity came. This wasn't about revenge anymore. Not about surviving another night. The phone in my pocket, the wristband on my arm, the presence of a deaf general who had decided his leave was over. These were the first bricks of a case being built, one that could finally expose Thomas for what he was. And for the first time, lying under sterile lights, I felt the weight of protection that came not from fear or silence, but from protocol. The first hours after surgery blurred into a haze of beeping monitors, antiseptic sting, and nurses' steady hands. But as the adrenaline bled away, what replaced it wasn't peace. It was dread. I knew Thomas. A gunshot wasn't the end of his fight. It was the opening move. He'd already be working the phones, spinning lies, playing the victim before my blood had even dried. I clutched the phone still buried in my cargo pocket, a weight heavier than any rifle. The evidence was there. I just had to live long enough to get it into the right hands. By morning, a woman in civilian clothes but with a badge clipped to her belt stepped into my room. She introduced herself softly. "Sergeant Karen Lewis, I'm your victim advocate. General Callahan asked me to come." Her voice was calm, not pitying, but steady in the way of someone who'd stood beside soldiers through worse storms than mine. She explained my immediate options: an emergency protective order, safe housing if I needed it, counseling. She placed a simple form on the tray table and pointed. "This is just paperwork, but paperwork builds walls that men like him can't climb." An hour later, another arrived, a young Army lawyer with glasses and a uniform as crisp as his tone. "Captain Mills, Special Victims Counsel. My job is to protect your rights, advise you on evidence, and ensure you're not alone in the system." He set a slim briefcase down and pulled out a notepad. "First question, Private Rogers, do you still have the phone?" I nodded, pulling it from my pocket with trembling fingers. My palm was raw where glass had cut me. "It's here." He didn't reach for it. Instead, he slid a form across the table. "Chain of custody. You sign that you're voluntarily transferring evidence. Detectives will image the device, then log it. You'll get a property receipt. That way it can't be twisted against you later." I signed, my name shaky but legible. He sealed the phone in an evidence bag, marked time and date, and handed it to the Charleston detective who had just arrived. An older man with weary eyes and a notebook thick with cases. The detective gave a small nod of respect before tucking the bag into his case. "We'll process it clean. If what's on here is what you say, it'll speak louder than any testimony." It didn't take long. Within hours, the first files surfaced. Debt threads with bookies, angry texts with threats typed in all caps, even drunken recordings of his own outbursts. There were photos of Will's, zoomed in on sections he wanted to contest, and pictures of me, sleeping, unaware, watched. The detective's jaw clenched as he scrolled. "This isn't just control," he muttered. "It's obsession." The advocate leaned toward me. "This is more than enough to file the protective order. We'll get it signed by a magistrate today." Meanwhile, the hospital staff prepared their own reports. ER intake, wound photos, wristband timestamps. All tiny receipts stacking into something larger. My life had been chaos, but now it was being written down in forms, reports, exhibits. And for once, those documents weren't weapons against me. They were shields. Still, Thomas was out there. He hadn't shown up at the hospital yet, but I knew his pattern. First charm, then threats. The advocate warned me. He'll try to reach your mother. He'll lean on her silence. We'll keep trying to contact her, but don't expect her to turn overnight. That truth hit harder than I expected. My mother's silence had been his fortress for years. If she stayed inside it, all this evidence could still fall flat. Captain Mills saw the doubt in my face. Listen to me, Private. You don't win by emotion. You win by documentation. By process. He's already trying to paint you as unstable. That's why we build a record step by step. You control your story. We control the evidence. His words landed like drill commands. Clear, measured, executable. By late afternoon, the order was filed. Thomas was barred from approaching me, barred from weapons, his name entered into the national system. A piece of paper, backed by the weight of the state. Not perfect, not foolproof. But it was a line in the sand, and this time it was the law standing beside me. I looked at the sealed evidence bag now locked away under detective custody and felt a strange calm. For years, Thomas had kept me prisoner with silence. Now it was silence that would destroy him. The silent records on that phone, the quiet signatures on protective orders, the mute weight of protocol grinding forward. And I realized something else. I wasn't fighting him alone anymore. The army, the law, strangers who owed me nothing. They had all stepped into the trench with me. And this time, Thomas Walker wasn't the one holding the terrain. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived like a storm front rolling in, inevitable, heavy, and thick with tension. By then, my shoulder was stitched and bandaged, but every movement reminded me of that night. Pain was my constant companion, but it was also proof. Proof that he had pulled the trigger. Proof that his lies could not erase what my body carried. I walked into the Charleston County Courthouse not as a victim dragged in by circumstance, but as a soldier reporting for duty. My Class A uniform was perfectly pressed, shoes shined, hair pulled back tight. Every crease was deliberate, every polished button a quiet declaration. I am not broken. Beside me walked General Callahan. He wore the same uniform, but with 3 silver stars gleaming above his breast pocket. His presence turned heads, drew murmurs from civilians and silence from anyone in uniform. He didn't need to say a word. His very arrival was testimony. A general didn't escort a soldier to court unless the army was watching closely. Across the aisle, Thomas sat slouched in a cheap gray suit, his tie crooked, his face feigning worry. His public defender whispered in his ear, but Thomas wasn't listening. His eyes darted between me and the jury box, searching for purchase, for pity. The judge called the session to order, and it began. Captain Mills, my counsel, presented the phone evidence first. He didn't sensationalize it. He laid it out like an after-action report. Texts to bookies, threats in his own words, videos of drunken violence. The jury's expressions shifted from skepticism to unease. Silence filled the room, the kind of silence that crushes excuses flat. Then came my testimony. I swore the oath, hands steady despite the hammering in my chest. I recounted the events like a soldier on debrief. At approximately 2100 hours, the subject produced a revolver, discharged it at close range, resulting in a wound near my clavicle. No theatrics, no tears, just clear, calm fact. Thomas's lawyer tried to dismantle me on cross. He leaned into stereotypes, suggesting combat training had made me unstable. Private Rogers, isn't it true the stresses of Army life can cause emotional outbursts? I looked him dead in the eye. Sir, I was trained to handle stress. I was trained to run toward the sound of gunfire. But there is no training manual for being shot in your own kitchen by family. A murmur rippled across the courtroom. The lawyer's face flushed, his next question stumbling. Then they called my mother. She looked fragile walking to the stand, her hands trembling around a crumpled tissue. For years she had been Thomas's shield, her silence his strongest weapon. If she faltered now, Everything might collapse. Thomas's lawyer went first, his voice syrupy with false sympathy. "Mrs. Rogers, wasn't your daughter agitated that night? Did she not struggle with your husband?" My mother hesitated. She stared at her lap, twisting the tissue tighter. Her silence filled the room. Then Captain Mills rose, but he didn't approach. He simply said, "Mrs. Rogers, please look at your daughter." Slowly, she lifted her gaze. Her eyes met mine. I didn't plead. I didn't beg. I just stood straight in my uniform, the same one she had once told me wasn't worth poking the bear for. "Linda," Mills said softly, "look at who she is now. Do you truly believe that soldier assaulted your husband?" For the first time in years, my mother's silence cracked. Tears spilled over as she whispered, then cried, No, it was him. It was always him. I was just so afraid." Thomas exploded. He shot up from his chair, slamming his fists on the table. "You treacherous witch," he roared, face purple, spit flying. The mask he had worn for years shredded in front of the jury. The bailiffs were on him in seconds, restraining him as he cursed and fought. But it didn't matter. His own rage had done the work. The jury had seen the real Thomas Walker, the man behind the suit, the man I had lived with for a decade. The judge's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. "Order," she barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. She turned a hard glare on Thomas. "You will sit down and remain silent, or you will be removed." But the damage was already done. His outburst hadn't just tipped the scales, it had shattered them. When the gavel finally fell to close the hearing, Thomas was charged with aggravated assault and unlawful discharge of a firearm. Bail was denied. He was led out in cuffs, his curses echoing uselessly in the marble hallway. I stood there in the aftermath, my body trembling not from fear, but from the release of years of tension. For once, he was the one trapped behind bars, and I was the one walking free. When the doors of the courtroom closed behind me, I didn't feel triumph. There was no surge of victory, no roar of celebration. What I felt was quieter, like exhaling after holding my breath for years. Relief, heavy and hollow at the same time. Thomas was gone. His mask had slipped in the most public way possible, and the justice system had finally seen him for what he truly was. 25 years. That was the sentence they handed down. Though in truth, no number on a page could repay the scars. But it was something. A line drawn by law. A promise that his reach could not extend to me anymore. The weeks that followed felt unreal. I stayed on base housing near Fort Bragg, my orders temporarily delayed while the Army finalized their own report. Around me, soldiers moved through their daily routines. PT runs before dawn, rifles on the range, boots echoing in formation. Their lives carried on like clockwork, and for the first time, I found peace in the rhythm. Word of what had happened spread quietly through the ranks. No speeches, no dramatic announcements. Just nods in the chow hall, steady handshakes in passing, the kind of silent acknowledgement that carries more weight than applause. They didn't see me as a victim. They saw me as a soldier who had fought a battle no one trains you for. And won. General Callahan became a constant presence in those days. Sometimes he said little, just sat beside me with the same calm strength he had shown that night in the hospital. Sometimes he offered guidance. Rogers, he signed one afternoon during a quiet walk across the parade field. Pain doesn't vanish, but it can be shaped, like iron in fire. What you do with it, that's your legacy. His words stayed with me. My mother reached out slowly at first. Letters, short phone calls, careful meetings in public spaces. Trust was fragile, and forgiveness wasn't immediate. But I learned something important. Forgiveness isn't about excusing the past. It's about reclaiming your future. Every time I spoke with her, I wasn't protecting Thomas's silence anymore. I was choosing my own peace. Months later, I stood in front of a room full of new recruits at Fort Jackson. My rank had changed. Sergeant now. the chevrons stitched crisp on my sleeve. The auditorium buzzed with restless energy. Hundreds of young faces looking up at me. Some eager, some afraid, some hiding scars of their own. I took the podium, the microphone catching my voice. "I'm not here to tell you about combat operations overseas," I began. "I'm here to tell you about the battles you may face at home, because sometimes the enemy isn't on the other side of the world. Sometimes it's in your own kitchen." I told them my story, not for pity, but as a lesson, about the importance of knowing your terrain, of reading weaknesses in your adversary, of protecting evidence like ammunition, about how silence can be a weapon against you, and how finding allies, even unexpected ones, can save your life. As I finished, the hall was silent. Then a single soldier stood and clapped. Others followed. Soon the room thundered with applause. Not for me, but for the truth I had carried into that space. That's when I understood something I hadn't before. My story wasn't just survival. It was armor. Armor for others walking the same path. And that is where my story ends. For now. If you've ever seen someone underestimated until they proved everyone wrong, tell me about it in the comments. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss tomorrow's story. This is Soldier Revenge. Quiet doesn't mean weak, and every day respect finds its way back to those who stand their ground.